Hi, everyone. I've tried to get the people over in the coffee place over, but they're getting their last mug of coffee, so hopefully they'll come in. I'm really pleased this morning to introduce Dr. Stuart Buck. He's here from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, and he's actually going to talk about, I think, quite a different topic for us, and whether philanthropy can promote scientific reproducibility. I'm sure he'll tell you all about what they're doing at the foundation, where they're doing a very impressive amount to promote scientific reproducibility. But you can decide for yourself whether they can do this. And we usually leave time for questions, I think I told you, but I'm sure there'll be lots of interest. So let me tell you a little bit about Stuart. First of all, he has no PowerPoint slides, so you'll really have to listen. He holds a PhD in education, so he must know that this is a better way to educate. And in education policy from the University of Arkansas, where he studied econometrics, statistics, and program evaluation. He also, that's his PhD, he also graduated with honors from Harvard Law School with a law degree and clerked for various judges in the U.S. Court of Appeals. He has bachelor's and master's degree in music performance. We have other music performers here from the University of Georgia. He wrote Acting White, a Yale University press book that discusses the history of education in African American community. Of interest to many of us here, especially the people in the center who recently did some volunteer work in the local school. So it's interesting too. I know it's not what you're talking about, but gosh, I'd love to hear about it. He's been a panelist at major academic conferences, including the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy, the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, and the Harvard Program on Education Policy and Governance and Stanford Law School. What he's doing now is he's at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, where he leads the Research Integrity Initiative, and it seeks to improve quality and reliability of scientific research in fields ranging from economics to cancer cell biology. Welcome.
Thanks for that introduction, Kay. I appreciate it, and thank you all for coming today on early in the morning. I appreciate that. I know it's a challenge to get here this early, so I appreciate it. Let me just pull up my notes here. So I thought I would start out with just a little bit about the background of the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So Laura and John Arnold themselves are about 41 or so. John Arnold, his background, he came out of Vanderbilt with a degree in economics, where he graduated in 3 years. He worked for Enron for a while as a natural gas trader. He always has to clarify it had nothing to do with the kinds of accounting shenanigans that went on there, but he was very successful. He made them a lot of money, like actual money, not fraudulent money. And so they gave him a bonus of $8 million at one point because he'd been so successful, and then he quit and launched his own hedge fund, whereupon he started taking investments from other people, and he was phenomenally successful as a natural gas trader. He had, sometimes I understand, he had months where he earned 100% return, a month over month. And so he very quickly became the youngest self-made billionaire, multi-billionaire in history until he was surpassed by the guy who founded Facebook. So he retired at 38, and he and his wife, Laura, who herself is very accomplished, she has degrees from Harvard, Yale, and Cambridge, and was a very successful corporate attorney. So she retired from practicing law, which also is very understandable. I don't know why anyone would practice law if they were married to a billionaire. So, having practiced law myself, so they basically retired from their careers and created a foundation to which they now have devoted their lives. They say it's their life's work. They intend to have this foundation until they die. And so they're very interested across the board in issues relating to evidence and rigor and the ways the evidence is used in government, for example. So we have an initiative on evidence-based policy in government, so supporting randomized trials on things like safety inspections or elements within the criminal justice system where you can do randomized trials. So for example, we're sponsoring a randomized trial in Louisville, Kentucky, of sending text messages and or phone calls to defendants who are scheduled to come in for a trial and oftentimes don't show up. And so the theory is that maybe some of them just forget, like their lives are chaotic, they don't have assistants telling them when to show up where, like I do. So if I would forget to show up if people didn't remind me. So maybe they just need reminders. So we're doing a randomized experiment on sending reminders to defendants in various fashions to see what gets them to show up. Because if they don't show up due to forgetfulness or just their chaotic lives, then that leads to a serious spiral downwards, because now there's a warrant out for their arrest, and it just makes things worse. So that's just one example. So the mission is promoting the use of evidence throughout government, throughout society. We have like I mentioned, an education initiative. So we have supported education reform in the sense of like charter schools and greater choice and opportunity for students. But along with that, have supported a lot of research efforts to see whether that actually works, because the owners are always concerned with whether the initiatives that they support actually work out, and how can we gather the most rigorous evidence and support randomized trials where that's possible within whatever sector they're working in, and if not, are there various observational study designs that we could use to figure out whether we're supporting a policy that works. Because the owners just have a deep concern that they don't want to be like a typical philanthropist who decides, okay, I like this or that cause, and I'm just going to dump money into it and then just pat myself on the back for having done so. I want to know whether it works, and if it doesn't work, then change directions. So that emphasis on using evidence and finding what works in whatever realm that they're involved in, from education to criminal justice, that kind of led to research integrity as a focus a few years ago. So I just started working at the foundation, and I can actually pinpoint a conversation with John Arnold where this interest really kind of arose and sparked further discussions. So John Arnold and I had been having a discussion with another fellow on evidence, the use of evidence in government. And then after we were kind of regrouping after the conversation, it turned out John Arnold had seen an article about a psychologist at Yale named John Barge. I don't know how many are familiar with this story, but so John Barge is an eminent psychologist at Yale, and he had done some experiments on priming, and specifically the concept of old age and priming students to think about concepts related to the elderly. And so in this particular experiment, he'd given people and college students lists of words to read on some pretext or another. And then in the treatment group, the control group had just a bunch of neutral words to have to read or classify or something like that. And the treatment group had mixed in with their words were various words related to being elderly. And so the notion is that that's going to make them sort of think about being elderly in some way. And so then he had one of his associates time the people as they left the room where the experiment had taken place. And of course, the people didn't know that this was the real purpose of the experiment. Time them as they walked down the hall. And then he announced the finding was that in the treatment group, the people who had been exposed to words about being elderly were slower in walking down the hall. So being made to think about elderly concepts, actually made them act more elderly. And so he had published articles on this. And then there were some other researchers who, I guess, were a little skeptical, as you can imagine. So they tried to replicate the experiment and found no effect. And so they published that they had been unable to replicate his finding. And so then John Barge wrote a couple of angry, just vehement columns in Psychology Today online that he later pulled down after people criticized them, but in which he accused the replicators of, I think, being empty-headed, and it was full of kind of derogatory language towards them because of some minor discrepancies in the experimental setup or whatever. So anyway, so John Arnold had seen this, and he was intrigued by the idea that that there were these incentives within academia to come up with some sort of like exciting, interesting, positive result that could then be kind of publicized, and people write columns and do TED Talks and whatever. Meanwhile, someone who does careful work of replication to see whether this highly publicized effect is actually real, or whether it holds up under maybe slightly different settings, that work is then criticized or oftentimes may not appear at all. So we started looking into things like the file drawer problem, the publication bias, in which Kay has written so much. And so from that just discussion about this little controversy, this little tempest in a teapot within psychology, led us to think about those issues more broadly. So we started, I started looking into it, and we started seeing this issue everywhere we looked. Clinical trials in medicine, not as bad as experimental psychology, I would say, but it's still, because it's a regulated industry, but there's still a lot of problems, as you know. And economics, social sciences in general, cancer cell biology, psychiatry. I mean, there's on and on. Every issue you look at, you find, okay, there's some intrepid souls somewhere who are like bravely pointing out that the emperor has no clothes, that we're publishing too much of the wrong stuff, we're not incentivizing replication, we're not incentivizing the people to come forward with the stuff that's in the file drawer, we're incentivizing the wrong things. And so that really bothered John Arnold, because I mean, he made, in my psychologizing of him, is that he made his fortune as a hedge fund trader, but and specifically being able to predict the future movements of the natural gas market. And when he was doing that, he relied enormously on having lots and lots of information, and the most accurate information he could find. He had meteorologists on his staff, just full-time meteorologists to help predict weather and climate patterns over the next year, so that he could take that into account in trying to predict what are the fluctuations in natural gas prices going to be. And so you don't make a lot of, in that kind of market, you don't make a lot of money by just wishful thinking or by looking for the positive results and then hoping that that's the truth. He made a lot of money by looking for the most information possible and then making the best informed judgment and prediction that he could make. And there's probably a lot of luck involved too, because there are other people on the other sides of all the kind of trading that he was doing who are also trying to be well informed. But so he came from that background where you wanted lots and lots of accurate information, and nothing to be left out, nothing to be left in the file drawer, no as little bias as possible. So it really bothered him that, in looking at the issues that philanthropy wants to address, the important societal issues about health and education and welfare of human beings, that the scholarship that we rely on is not the best and fullest representation of the facts, but it's instead this biased subset of what people could have been researching or were researching. And there's so much left behind and left out. There's so much room for manipulation when people are incentivized to come up with positive results. There's room for outcome switching. There's room for statistical kind of specification searching. Looking for the model that gives you the most exciting positive results that a journal editor will find more pleasing, and that reviewers will be less tempted to say, "Oh, why didn't you try this?" And maybe your p-value would be under 0.05. So that really, I think, underlies our interest in research integrity and reproducibility in science. It's just the desire that we as a society have more accurate information about all the decisions that we have to make, whether it's in policy or in government or as patients, clinicians, etc. So the main question that I told Kay I wanted to talk about is, can philanthropy really make a difference here? I hope so. I mean, we're trying. But so I thought I would talk a little bit about our strategy, the way we think about this issue, and how we can hopefully make a difference. And in the question and answer time, welcome any thoughts anyone has about other strategies we should be thinking of, if you have any such thoughts, or any criticisms. Definitely open to that. So the first and probably most minor way that I see that we can make a difference in the way research is conducted is that we ourselves fund a lot of research. So we fund it's mostly in the social sciences that we fund directly fund researchers and what they're doing. So we have a set of policies that we impose, sometimes to researchers' dismay at first, but then they usually accept the conditions because they'd rather have the money than not. But so we impose conditions like registration, which is a much newer idea in the social sciences, economics, education research, et cetera, than it is in clinical trials in medicine. But we make people register even when they're doing kind of observational historical work. So we're funding some work by an economist at the University of Michigan looking at the introduction, for example, of food stamps back several decades ago, and how it was rolled out across different counties at different times, and then trying to analyze the effect of food stamps through these sort of discontinuities and when it was implemented. So, I mean, the idea being that people in different counties didn't necessarily select to live in that county because they knew it was going to get food stamps this year rather than next. And so hopefully there's not a lot of selection bias on individuals' part. But so anyways, this is historical research from 4 or 5 decades ago. And so we're telling her, you have to register. We want you to state your hypothesis, what outcomes you're looking for, your statistical methodology. And she was a little bit taken aback, like no one registers this kind of stuff in economics. I've never really heard of this. But she's happily complying. I mean, she had written up a kind of research design anyway to submit a proposal to us. So we're making people do that. Then we make people disclose their data, make their data available as much as is possible. Oftentimes it isn't in the kind of research we fund because of HIPAA or because of in education. There's another law, FERPA, the Federal Privacy Act, that not only prevents you from publicly disclosing data, but also says you have to destroy your data set when you're done with your research. So there are various constraints like that, obviously, and so we don't try to make people disobey the law, but we say our language says that you have to make your data available to the maximum extent that's legally permissible. And people sometimes try to argue with that, but we say, look, if we're funding this research, we want the data to be as available as possible. We also make people disclose their code, this kind of statistical analysis code that they might have written up in Stata or R, or other programs, SAS, SPSS, so that, and usually that's not going to be confidential. I mean, it'd be pretty rare. I mean, like maybe you wrote code specifically to. I mean, I don't see how you would necessarily write anything in your code that involves confidential patient identifiers or that kind of thing. So we tell people they have to make your code available. Then we also have a kind of open access policy for results that your results have to be publicly available at some point, even if you don't publish them. So we don't want there to be any file drawer for any of the research that we fund. You have to publish it, and if you publish in a journal that has a fee for access, like that one of these mini journals that say, if you want this article, you have to pay $35, and you get, a screenshot for 24 hours or something ridiculous like that. We tell them, okay, you can publish there if you want, but you have to make a working paper available somewhere on your website or something like that. So it can't be all behind kind of paywalls. So that's one area that we can have some direct influence by just kind of forcing people to do what we think is the right thing. As far as having broader influence, I think that I put our efforts into two main categories. One is through influencing policies at other funders, like government funders in particular, or journals. And I'll talk more about specific efforts that we have there. So obviously, NIH, NSF fund way more research than we will ever fund. If they fund way more research every year than we will fund in our entire existence. So anything that they can do, it's a little bit like trying to shift the Titanic, it feels like, but anything that they can do to make any marginal improvement is going to have a huge impact. And then the same for journals. Journals obviously have a huge impact on what people who submit there do. The International Association of Medical Journal Editors had a huge effect on registration when it came out with its policy in 0405, and I hope they have a similarly large effect with their recent announcement that they want, or I guess they're considering, they want in comments, but a proposal that people have to find a way to disclose clinical trial data when they publish on clinical trials. So that's exciting, and so we're interested in that, promoting that kind of policy, not just in medical journals, but all other journals as well in other sciences or social sciences. And then, so there's the policy of funders and journals, and then there's also the creation of tools and software that make it easier for people to do the right thing, and that's another effort on our part. So I think there are a lot of studies in behavioral economics that suggest that people are surprisingly easily deterred from doing the right thing if there are even seemingly minor obstacles in their way. So some of the most famous research from behavioral economics has to do with whether people save in their 401k. Now, you would think that people are going to make the same rational decision anyway, right, about whether they save in their 401k. If they want to set aside 5% of their income or whatever, then they'll just do that, right? But it actually makes a huge difference in a number of studies whether the policy of the company or the organization is that you have to go sign up to be in a 401k and to start depositing money, or whether you're automatically enrolled and then you have to go fill out a form to withdraw, to not be in the 401k. And so under the latter policy, way more people start saving in their 401k because they don't want to fill out a form to not be in the 401k. Whereas if you just make them fill out a form to be in the 401k in the first place, a lot of them don't do it. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, really, because, I mean, this is a financial decision that, could affect like tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars at various points in your life. Why would just filling out a form of paper, whether you do that or not, why would that make such a 40-50% swing, percentage point swing in whether or not you make this huge financial decision? And yet it seemingly does. There are other examples. So there's a famous experiment with H&R Block, where they, in the treatment group, they helped fill out the federal application for student aid, FAFSA, for people to help kind of populate the fields automatically for people or for their children, actually. And it resulted in I forget the effect, it was something like I want to say 19 to 20 percentage point gain in the number of kids who are going to college. That's pretty huge, right? I mean, like filling out a form for student aid versus going to college. I mean, surely people could spend an hour doing that or a few hours in order for the chance to go to college. And yet, when you made it, that just took away that administrative burden on their part, all of a sudden there's a huge jump in their willingness to go to college and to apply for student aid. So basically, I mean, what I take away from these studies is that people want to do the right thing, but they're easily deterred. Or less euphemistically, maybe they're lazy. I mean, people just they fall into these default patterns in their lives where they just do what comes habitually, and it's hard to get them off that path when there are any obstacles in the way. So within the realms of like data sharing or sharing code or registering in social sciences, if it seems like this is a huge administrative burden on people's part, that you're trying to impose conditions where if you want to do the right thing as a researcher, you have to spend an extra month of work, and you have to take time away from writing the next proposal for a grant or supervising grad students and postdocs, and you have to instead do all this extra work to make your data available for someone else to use where the benefits aren't going to even accrue to you. I mean, a lot of people might, in theory, agree, okay, data sharing is great, but I'm really busy. I'm going to move on. Like the hurdles are too high. So our idea is that providing better tools and software to make it more streamlined for people to share data. So better systems where, like, if you're working in a particular project and it saves your data in a version controlled manner, and the only thing you have to do at the end is hit a button that says publish, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Then all of a sudden it removes the obstacles to data sharing that people will otherwise point to. And so it makes it easier for people to live up to their own professed values. So those are the kind of three ways I see through our own research grants, and telling people what to do, trying to influence policies at funders and journals, and then trying to just make it easier and more streamlined for people to do the right thing. And so now I thought I would talk about some of our projects specifically. So one is that we launched this organization that's based in Charlottesville called the Center for Open Science. And it's led by a psychological researcher named Brian Nosek and some colleagues of his. They were people that we came across about 3 years ago, and we started looking into this issue in psychology in particular. And Brian and his colleagues had written some stuff and been trying to promote these ideas in psychology, but as is often the case, it's kind of a part-time hobby while his full-time job was teaching at the University of Virginia and running a psychology lab and doing all the typical academic things. And what we told him was, look, we'd like to support the things that you're doing, but we want it to be more of a full-time thing. So can you take leave from the University of Virginia? So that's what he's been doing ever since. He started the Center for Open Science, which is independent of the University of Virginia. I think maybe a little bit to their dismay, perhaps. But so he's been on leave ever since from Virginia and has been leading that effort. And so one of the major things that they've been doing is developing the software they call the Open Science Framework. And it serves precisely the function I was describing. So it serves as a kind of collaboration and project management tool that scientists can use to support their work. So they can save data there, save code, or they can use places like GitHub and link it to a project there, or Dropbox and link it to a project on the Open Science Framework. And it's easy to collaborate with people wherever they are just by adding them as a collaborator. Then they can see and work with the materials that you have. And then at any point in a project, if you want to make your stuff public, and you can, right? I mean, it's not confidential information. There's a little button at the top that says publish, and you can publish selected parts of. I mean, you can publish your code, but not your data if that's what you need to do. But the point is that it makes it much easier. Like if you're using this process, this software to, hopefully streamline your daily work as well, then it also streamlines the process of making that work public at the end. So you can click a button, make public, and then it says, "Are you sure?" And then you're done, right? So there's no longer any huge. If people use that, then there's no longer any huge obstacles. They don't have to say, "Oh, it's so much extra work," to make my stuff public. No, actually, just click a couple buttons and you're done. Like it's easier than buying stuff on Amazon. So I think that's the way scientific work should be done in the future. It should be done through these sorts of systems that make it easy to save work, to use version control, use these more sophisticated methods that make it easier to keep track of what's happened at each step along the way, and then make it really easy to publicize the whole process if you want. So another thing the Center for Open Science has done is they've been leading several kind of replication projects. So one was called the Reproducibility Project in Psychology. It was published in Science this past summer, and so they took 100 psychology experiments from top journals and sampled them out of some top journals over a set of years, and then systematically set about replicating these experiments in labs across the world. It had something like 270 researchers involved in this project. So there's this massive effort to coordinate and collaborate. And they found that depending on exactly how you define what replication is, like they have like 5 different definitions in the paper. So like, do the confidence intervals overlap? I mean, there are various definitions. But around 35 to 40% of the experiments they found could be successfully replicated. And so I think it's probably the largest or systematic effort to replicate, independently replicate through new experiments work in any discipline, at least that I'm aware of. So, it came out, it had a huge amount of publicity. It was covered in all the major news outlets, New York Times, Economist, et cetera, which is cool. I mean, it's fun to see the work that you support covered in that way, although that's not the end, that's not really the goal. I mean, it's not just have people talk about it and then go back to their normal methods of business, but hopefully by funding projects like that, I think maybe we can be, here's the analogy I would draw. Let's say you have a road where lots of people are speeding, like we're not the cops as a foundation. We can't give people tickets. Like we can't change the law. We can't change the speed limit. You know, so but we can put up a sign at the side of the road that like points at people and says, hey, your speed is actually 15 miles over the limit. So I see us as kind of in that function some of the time. Like so we can't make psychology researchers do things differently. We can't make NSF change its policies. We can't change those things directly. Like we don't have that power, for better or for worse. But we can fund a project like this that exposes what the problems are in a particular discipline, and is kind of like a signpost that says, okay, here's a problem. Like you as a discipline need to figure out ways to fix this. And so we're funding a similar replication project in cancer cell biology. Cancer cell biology, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the kind of much cited articles by some researchers at Amgen and Bayer. There are a couple of different articles where they claimed that they'd been trying to replicate some, according to them, highly published, published and respected outlets, some experiments, and had been largely unsuccessful. I think in Amgen's case, they could replicate 6 out of 53, something like that. And one of the authors of that article said that he tried to work with the original labs who'd done these cancer cell biology experiments. And in one case, the original investigator told him, oh, that experiment, we did that one 6 times, and we published the one time that it worked. And so issues of publication bias there. I mean, the kind of optimistic explanation would be, well, this is a really difficult cancer cell biology experiment. It takes a lot of sophistication and skill, and we got it right that one time. The other times we didn't get it right. Maybe, but maybe the one time you got it right was actually a fluke. So it'd be good to know about the other times you didn't get it right. So anyway, we're funding a replication project. Originally, I should confess, it's run into some stumbling blocks. So originally we were going to replicate 50 cancer cell biology experiments with the kind of sampling framework where we were taking top cited and downloaded articles from a set of years, recent years, and then systematically replicating them. We've had to scale back a little. We had to put more money in the project and scale back to something like 37 to 40 experiments. And it's not that the project was mismanaged in any way. It's just that actually the experiments turned out to be much more expensive. And part of the reason is that the original experiments just aren't really described very well in the publications, as it turns out. So when the people go and try to replicate what was done in a particular experiment that's been published, they find that, wait, there's lots of missing information that we don't know. The methods aren't fully described. They aren't fully describing exactly the materials and reagents that they're using in this experiment. And so they go and try to work with the original PI and sometimes get the answer that, well, it was somebody else who worked on that and they're gone. And so they just have to do a lot of detective work to try to figure out what happened. And sometimes the original PI will tell them, oh, yeah, what we published in the paper wasn't exactly what we did, so here's what we really did in the experiment. And then you have to think, okay, are we replicating the paper or are we replicating the actual experiment? Kind of decisions like that. And then it always ends up making the experiment more expensive. No one ever comes back and says, oh, yeah, you actually can do that experiment with less materials and less expensive stuff. It's always like, oh, yeah, you need all this extra stuff. So for each experiment, they come up with a list on an Excel chart that's this long, listing all the materials that they need, and or the mice and the specific breeds and so forth. And so everything ended up being more expensive and taking longer than they had originally planned. And so, as I say, we had to put more money into it and scale it back. But so that's in progress, and we'll hopefully see some results. Some of the experiments take a long time, it turns out, as well. But there's interestingly enough, there's been some kind of preemptively defensive coverage of that in, I think, Nature News and places like that, where some of the experimentalists whose work is being replicated are kind of already going to the press and saying, look, we're not sure about this project. We don't know if people are skilled enough to replicate what we do. My work is so sophisticated that no one else could ever hope to do what I do, and so forth. But and again, maybe there's something to that. Maybe there is a high degree of skill required, and not anyone can go do it. I mean, I wouldn't hope to be able to like directly replicate any of these experiments. That's not my expertise. But at the same time, I mean, it still seems a little bit self-serving as an explanation. I mean, if someone's work is so delicate and fragile that they are the only person in history who will ever be able to do that experiment, and no one can ever do it again, then it doesn't seem very useful as a scientific discovery. It doesn't seem very robust or very productive in terms of being able to provide the basis upon which future scientific work can be built. I mean, it seems like it's more like an anecdote at that point than a true like basis of science and the march of discovery going forward. It's more like an anecdote that one guy got something to work once. Okay, well, that's nice. Is it science? Is it something we can build upon and actually use? Is it even true? Like, who knows at that point? So anyway, so that's one thing the Center for Open Science has been doing. Another thing that they've been helping coordinate is a set of guidelines, and this involves working with journals, a set of guidelines for publication in the social and behavioral sciences. And so the guidelines that they've come up with in combination with AAAS and Science and some top psychology journals and other related journals in social and behavioral sciences, so those are called the TOP guidelines, which stands for Transparency and Openness Promotion, which is a little bit awkward name, but it spells TOP, so that's what we named it. So the TOP guidelines are this kind of basically elaborate chart with several different categories and several different levels. So involving issues like registration, openness of data, openness of code, et cetera, et cetera. And then within each of those categories, there's like different levels. So a journal could commit to level 1, level 2, level 3 being the most kind of onerous, shall we say, or the most stringent in terms of the conditions it imposes upon the authors. So in other words, mandatory. Yeah, so a journal could make registration mandatory for all studies, for example, or a journal could, at level 1, the lowest level, a journal could say, we recognize registration when it occurs. Yeah, that's something. That's more than a lot of journals do now in a lot of disciplines. So we can develop these guidelines, and then we've had, several hundred journals in social and behavioral sciences that have committed to adopt the guidelines in some fashion. We'll see what that actually works out to, because as everyone knows, I'm sure, even within medical journals, there's a history of adopting guidelines, but then actually enforcing them such that they actually mean anything, that's a different question. So Evan, sitting in their audience, he was a participant in this process. So we'll see what happens with that. Another issue, or another organization that we helped set up is called Metrics, the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford. It's headed by Steve Goodman and John Ioannidis, and it's focused on trying to improve the quality of medical research. They just had a major conference out at Stanford in November. Kind of interesting anecdote. Metrics, the way they chose that name is because it spelled the word metrics, and it was otherwise kind of uninterpretable. So they originally wanted to call it the Center for Medical Truth. This is going to be online, isn't it? So I guess I can say this. They originally wanted to call it the Center for Medical Truth, and the administration at Stanford vetoed that because to say that you're the Center for Truth, well, that implies that what everyone else is doing may be less than true, which could be. I mean, it's it is kind of the theme of John Ioannidis' work. Most published research is false. It's his most famous article. Nonetheless, people don't like you being so kind of in your face about it with calling it the Center for Medical Truth. So I had to move on. They next wanted to call it the Center for Unbiased Research. Ran into the same objection. The administration is like, well, you're unbiased? Yeah, what are the rest of us doing? So ended up with the Meta Research Innovation Center, which no one knows. And they abbreviated it as Metrics. So it's completely inoffensive to the rest of the Stanford community, so it could go forward. But interestingly, it ends up being misinterpreted sometimes, because by calling it meta research, people often think you're only about meta-analysis, and they're not doing meta-analysis at all. So they'll be confused on the Stanford campus sometimes with people who think, oh, you just do meta-analysis or something. So it's an interesting problem to try to figure out how to talk about and present these issues within academia. So I mean, it's a kind of humorous story about the names, but it does hit on a difficult issue of like how to communicate with people when the message is what you're doing is wrong and you need to change. I mean, that can come off as a little bit preachy and confrontational even, and so it's always an interesting problem to try to help nudge people along in what you think is the right direction without beating them over the head and causing an overreaction against what you're doing. So we also have a lot of efforts to improve clinical trial transparency. So there's a public campaign called All Trials that has been seemingly very successful in Europe in promoting and transparency there and inspiring people, patient advocacy groups, et cetera, to join in the cause and to demand transparency about clinical trials. So we funded that group to launch in the United States. So there's another effort with Jennifer Miller, who's now at New York University, to basically rank and rate new drugs as they're approved by the FDA based on how transparent the pharma companies have been about the clinical trials that were done. And she had a small pilot project. I say small, it involved reviewing several hundred clinical trials, but reviewing some drugs that were approved in 2012, and then basically ranking the pharma companies. And so GSK had been most transparent in the drugs that she reviewed. They had been 100% transparent in disclosing at least the results of the clinical trials and supporting the drugs that had been reviewed. There were other companies that were as low as 22 or 23%. Like they basically were hiding most of the clinical trials. And so she's going to be able to do that more systematically year by year. And so hopefully by just putting a little sunshine on what the pharma companies are doing and whether or not they're disclosing clinical trials, it will incentivize some of them to improve. And it's an interesting phenomenon, by the way, as a kind of a side note, on the effectiveness of policy in this area. So I mentioned trying to change policy. And policy is obviously important, but it's interesting to me that you have such a vast disparity in what pharma companies do, both above and below what policy actually requires. So policy, or even the federal law, would say you have to disclose results of most clinical trials, or at least to support FDA applications, within 12 months of trial completion. And there are a lot of companies that don't even obey that law, like the federal law, like they just ignore it. Whereas there are some companies like GSK that have, GSK, most of you are probably familiar with the stuff that Frank Rockwell's been doing in the clinicalstudyDataRequest.com, and as difficult to use as that system might be, and I know like some of you have published on that, even so, the fact that they're trying to put 1,700 data sets out there, actual individual patient level data, which no law requires, no policy. The FDA is not telling them to do this. No one's like making them do it. They're just undertaking the effort voluntarily. Although I should say they've been fined in the past for misrepresenting results of clinical trials. So it might be kind of preemptive defensive action on their part. But even so, they're still doing something that no law or policy requires, way above and beyond. They've spent millions of dollars and dedicated lots of personnel over the past 10 years to making thousands of clinical trials available, so the data sets available. So it's just interesting to me that like you have such a disparity in behavior. So some companies that fall short of even doing the minimal standard of what the law requires in terms of disclosing results, and some companies that go far above and beyond. So it just is a reminder. I remind myself of that sometimes. Is telling me about the limitations of policy, or they're looking for ways to influence people other than policy, because policy that isn't enforced, won't have much effect on people who are determined to ignore it. And by the same token, there are obviously some things that motivate some people or organizations to go far above and beyond what policy requires. So then another person whose efforts we supported is Ben Goldacre over in the UK. So he has a number of projects related to clinical trials or medicine generally. So one project he has that's kind of cool. It's called openprescribing.net. So he has, thanks to the UK system, he has data on prescriptions by basically every physician in the UK. And so he had someone help code this up, and so he can produce all these kind of graphical displays of who's prescribing what, all down to the individual physician or practice level, all across the UK. And so you can look at, I mean, literally like every single drug and prescription for any drug or device. And so you can compare, different statins. I mean, if there's one statin that's on patent and one that's not, they're equivalent. You can compare like who's using the expensive one all across the UK. You can pinpoint them. You can have a color-coded map. So it's kind of cool. Like he's doing interesting projects like that hopefully shed light on like what are the actual practices that are happening out there. Then we have efforts to support more data sharing within the clinical trial realm. So the stuff GSK is doing, I think more places ought to be doing that. And I think there ought to be some sort of independent nonprofit organization, and the Harvard Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center is trying to help coordinate the creation of such an organization. So we sponsored a conference there last year, and Wellcome Trust is also helping fund this effort. So the idea is there needs to be some independent nonprofit that helps coordinate data sharing, it helps host data where necessary, or helps kind of coordinate and combine across the different places that are sharing data now, such as GSK's platform. There's Yale's, the Open Data Access Project. There's Duke and their effort with Bristol, and all these kind of independent platforms that are cropping up for sharing data from clinical trials. And it would be better if people could at least have one platform to search and see what's available, and ideally one day be able to combine across from different platforms, combine the data and do meta-analysis that actually looks at the individual patient level data. So that's something that we're interested in supporting in the future. There are also, I would say, efforts to support greater use of registration in social science. I'm looking at working with a number of professional associations. So there's an education association called the Society for Research and Educational Effectiveness. They're interested in developing a registry within education experiments, or observational studies too. The American Society for Criminology is interested in developing a registry for criminological experiments. There's the American Economic Association, which already has a registry called socialscienceregistry.org. They're interested in doing some work to help populate that registry and help, basically keep things going. And psychology, which I've already mentioned. And then I see I'm approaching the end of my time, actually a lot of time for questions and answers. As far as what we do in the future, I'm interested in figuring out what to do in fields like psychiatry, preclinical research, and nutritional epidemiology. I highlight those in particular just because I've seen so much evidence of problems in those fields. Nutritional epidemiology, I would say it just seems like a literature that's filled with false positives, that's filled with kind of very small correlations that are then presented as causation. So it just seems very problematic to me. Preclinical research, Malcolm McLeod and others have done a tremendous job of exposing problems in that area. I'm interested in figuring out ways that philanthropy can help promote better standards in that field, and cancer cell biology as well. And then psychiatry, I just read a book recently about the kind of immense problems that psychiatry has had, both in, it's a less objective area of medicine, I suppose. It's a lot of the conditions are kind of hard to pinpoint. You don't have things like cholesterol level. There aren't as many objective, hard measures of what's actually even going on in terms of defining the conditions or diseases. And then there have been so many cases where clinical trials have just gone unreported and hidden, and side effects not really disclosed. And so that's an interesting area that I wish I could do more in. Then there's, as far as future work, interested in figuring out ways to encourage registration of more observational research, not just experiments. I think that's really important. It's really hard because, we've tried it ourselves in research that we support. It is a little bit hard to know whether the registration is actually coming in advance of people having used the data and looked at it in the ways that they're planning to do, right? So registering in a post hoc way obviously doesn't serve the same purposes as registering in advance. But by the same token, it seems to me there's perhaps more opportunity for mischief in observational research in general than there would be in experiments. Ultimately, an experiment, if it's well designed and you don't have a huge number of issues with attrition, et cetera, a t-test of means of the two groups is kind of a basic. It's hard to mess up, right? But other types of observational designs, there's lots of ways that people can specification search and just end up with false positive results that are easier to remain hidden or harder to find out, to put it inversely. So interested in that area. Also interested in working with FDA and NIH to support the various kind of open data policies or initiatives that they are thinking about. And then finally, just another example of work I'm interested in supporting in the future, interested in figuring out how to support journals to use innovative kind of publication mechanisms like so-called registered reports. And some of you may be familiar with that term. It's a term that some psychology and cognitive science journals are using for the idea that you, as an author, you come up with a study design and you submit that for publication, and the journal sends it out for peer review, and it comes back with a provisional acceptance or rejection. Obviously, they can do that. But if they give you provisional acceptance, then you go forward with the experiment and collect the data and analyze it, and then go back, and you basically are guaranteed acceptance as long as you don't completely screw up the experiment. And the nice thing about this is, well, there are lots of nice things. One is that peer review takes place on the basis of the experimental design, not on the basis of did you get a positive result. So the peer review is not biased by people thinking, oh, we didn't get a positive result, but there should have been. So did you do the right thing? Let me suggest a different experiment. Let me suggest analyzing your data in a different way. And so then you end up with the kind of peer review kind of generating false positives. Instead, peer review occurs at the stage of experimental design. So if people want to encourage improvements at that point, then you can actually incorporate those into the experiment that you do. And then I think it improves incentives on the authors or the experimenters' part as well, because now that you already have a provisional acceptance of this experimental design, now you can run your experiment, and if you get kind of null results or kind of messy, complex results that are kind of hard to interpret, you can just tell that and explain it, and come forward with the truth as best as you see it, and you've already been accepted as a journal. You don't have to package it up as a nice story in which you had the hypothesis and you collected the data, and lo and behold, your hypothesis was correct, and the p-value is 0.049 or less, and everything is wonderful. Instead, you can just tell the whole messy truth, and knowing that everyone has already reviewed and accepted the paper based on the quality of the design and the methods. So, as I said, there are a few journals that have been trying this out in psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience. I know there's someone in political science who's interested in trying that for some political science type experiments. And I think it's a kind of publication mechanism that more journals ought to try. Maybe we should be publishing clinical trials that way. So, draw up a protocol for the clinical trial, and before you even run it, submit it to New England Journal or JAMA, and they'll decide, okay, we'll publish this trial, whatever the results are. I don't know. Maybe that might be worth an innovation worth considering. So I think I've taken up more than my allotment of time, so I need to throw it open to some questions and answers, or questions at least. Hey, thanks. Yes, right there.
Thanks so much. That was really informative and fascinating. I have a question about cell line misidentification. Does that factor into reproducibility?
It does. In fact, I promise this wasn't a setup, but I actually was meeting with some folks at the NIH yesterday afternoon, and someone from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and a couple of folks from the Global Biological Standards Institute had a meeting at 4 p.m. yesterday in our DC office on that very topic. So yes. Yeah, it's a serious issue. Lots of problems. I would say I put it back in the framework of both kind of tools and incentives. So I think that funders and journals ought to be looking for that more often, requiring it, or if not requiring it, at least rewarding it. Like journals ought to make it. I think one thing journals could do without being so onerous as to require it, if they're unwilling to do that, is at least put a little stamp of, like a little badge at the top of an article that says the cells in this article were real, or were authenticated, right? So that way it's a clear signal to anyone who's reading that they don't have to dig through a bunch of footnotes or supplemental material to find out, is this was this work done on the correct cells? Just that at the top, and then if by providing that signal, then it also sends a negative signal about the articles that don't have that badge, right? So now if you're a reader and you see 10 articles that have the badge and 10 that don't, then you start to say, the 10 that don't have the badge that says the cells were authenticated, what does that say about the credibility of those articles? And so it can create a sort of peer pressure on the part of both the journals and the authors and the community that's reading the articles to, you better get that badge, so that everyone knows that your work is credible. Yeah, that's something that's has been actually, that's actually an initiative of the Center for Open Science, not on cells in particular, but with regard to issues like open data. So at the Center for Open Science, they've been working with some journals in psychology to put a little badge at the top of articles that, for example, make the data available. And so they started this at one journal last year, about a year and a half ago, a journal called Psychological Science. And the rate at which articles had been making data available was about 3%, and it stayed at 3% for like comparator journals. But the rate at which articles made data available after they started putting this badge at the top rose to 38% in just pretty much overnight. So just allowing authors to send that signal, and also the journals in turn sending a signal to authors that, hey, this is an important thing that we care about, whether you're signaling to readers. That in and of itself, it seems to have led to tenfold or more increase in the willingness of authors to make data available, just by allowing them to say, hey, this an article has data. So anyway, that'd be something to try within cell line authentication, but also providing like the tools and methods to do so. So there, as I understand it, I'm not an expert on this at all, but as I understand it, so there are methods for authenticating human cells that were developed by forensic scientists long ago, but there's less availability of good methods to authenticate mouse cells, as I understand it, or other like non-human species that do form the basis of a lot of preclinical research. And so to the extent we're thinking about working with NIST maybe to help develop better methods that are more streamlined and cheaper and just well known and defined, where someone who wanted to authenticate their mouse cells for their research, just make it a way for them to do so. That could enable progress as well. In the back. Mm-hmm.
A name like that, like Good Pharma, you think that it's going to cover a broader area besides just looking at clinical trial policies or disclosure policies, and especially when these companies are engaging in other activities as well, and there's informed practice violations, false dynamics, and things around drug prices that are coming up that the foundation's also funding. And I'm wondering how these different parts can interact in terms of your strategy as a foundation, and to change not just one small aspect of pharmaceutical companies, but kind of what the different disparities that underlie the core business model.
Yeah, so I know Jennifer Miller's and other people very interested in the entirety of pharma practices, not just clinical trial transparency. That's the place where she's starting. I guess you have to start somewhere. So, but she's interested in other issues as well. If you listen to her describe it, there are several stages at which pharma companies' practices can be ethical or not, and ending up with if you've done trials in developing countries, like, do you make the drugs available, and the drugs work, like, do you make the drugs available to the people of that country that you kind of exploited for the trial? So there's a whole realm of ethical practices that Jennifer Miller is worried about. I mean, clinical trial transparency is one where she's kind of starting at, but I know her ambitions would be to make it broader in the future and encompass the whole kind of spectrum of practices. As far as how I work with other people in the foundation, I mean, I collaborate with people there, other people there all the time. So there's a woman named Kelly Ree who works on health policy quite a bit and pharma pricing, and I work with her constantly. Our offices are like 20 feet apart, and so yeah, we're always consulting each other. And so a lot of the stuff that we fund involves research of some kind, and so I get involved in every one of those grants to say, okay, like, how are our standards of our own standards of transparency being implemented here, and what do I think of the research design of the research that we're supporting? So yeah, I work closely with everybody basically. Yeah, Evan.
Some of what you're working on is very implementation focused, getting journals to do things that we think they should be doing, and some of it is much more research focused, trying to figure out what other problems exist that we haven't quite figured out yet. How do you see the foundation's balance between those things going forward? Is it going to be more implementation research, mix of the two? How will you decide that?
That's hard to answer. That's a good question. Let me be honest. A lot of the stuff that I've done to date in my particular area, just to be completely forthcoming, it's been a little bit opportunistic. Sometimes it's, like medicine is at a different place than psychology, for example, and so if I want to fund efforts to improve social science or behavioral science, like, you got to start somewhere, and you got to work with the people who are already thinking about those issues and who may not have been doing it full time at all. And here's what they have, like, to go with. And so, right, I can't remake the world in my own imagination. Like, I just have to work with the world as it is. And so, like, okay, here's several interesting projects that have something to do with social and behavioral sciences, and it's the best we got. Let's run with this, and then try to build other things as we go forward. But it's not. I can't claim that there's any kind of grand strategy where I'm manipulating all of the pieces on the chessboard and yeah. I wish it were like that, but yeah, you have to kind of work with what's there and what the ideas that are there, and so. And the people who are interested in and willing to carry out those ideas, and so have to be, I think, somewhat opportunistic. That that cancer cell biology is another example. I mean, there had already been some efforts to replicate experiments in that field, and so then there was a proposal we want to systematically do it and name names, like whose experiments we couldn't replicate. So I thought, okay, well, somebody ought to be doing something in that field. Here's a thing that can be done. Let's do it. But I mean, it's not like I have it's not like I even can say, okay, here is a complete picture of cancer cell biology and every possible way to improve it, and I've funded the exact thing that's going to have the maximal impact. I mean, in some ways I had to fund what is possible and what somebody is willing to do. So there are those kinds of constraints.
So unfortunately our time's up, and
Time's
we're
up.
on a schedule that classes dictate.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Yes, thanks.